this was part of the Cold War U.S. was waging with the Soviets as well, because Soviet Union at the end of the World War II, they sent over 1 million Red Army into Manchuria to capture it from the Japanese. And so Soviet very soon they have control of the entire Manchuria. They control the very important port city of Dalian, or AKA Port Arthur. This is a goal, the port that Russian always wanted. Russia always want like a warm water ports, right? And this is, they consider this is a return to Port Arthur. After their defeat by the Japanese Imperial Army back in the 1904-05 Russo-Japanese War. So the one of the reason, so Port of Dalian, if you look at the map, Port of Dalian is like right here. American 7th Fleet set up their headquarters just on the peninsula, just a little bit down south in Qingdao. So when the Soviet Far Eastern Fleet and the American 7th Fleet leave out the port, they will literally run into each other, right? So this is another reason, the Soviet, they throw their back, they finally throw their back into the Chinese communists in the Chinese Civil War. And so, very quickly the communists won, and then the Americans were kicked out. At that time, U.S. withdrew. U.S. ambassador left, and then U.S. started a decade-long policy of economic blockade against China, economic sanction and blockade, right? Because right after establishment of People's Republic in 1949, Korean War broke out in 1950, and then right after the Korean War broke out in June, President Truman authorized the U.S. 7th Fleet to sail down their aircraft carrier groups into the Strait of Taiwan to prevent the Chinese People's Liberation Army from crossing the Taiwan Strait to liberate Taiwan. So the Taiwan issue remained today
It
because
sounds
of
so
that.
familiar.
And because Mao already had about 500,000 men stay ready to go to Taiwan, because they were blocked by the U.S. 7th Fleet. Mao's, okay, let's send them to Korea. And so China entered the Korean War in October that year. So there's a chronology is important. U.S. first sending the 7th Fleet in the Taiwan Strait in July, and then China then sent the army that was supposed to go to Taiwan to Korea in October 1950, and China entered the Korean War. So after the Korean War, there was basically complete diplomatic, economic blockade of China by the U.S.-led Western camp until basically 1972, right? But Pakistan played a role because Pakistan was a go-between between Henry Kissinger and China, because Pakistan already have good relationship with China after 1962 China-India war, and so really the relationship got a reset after Nixon visited China, and then in 1972, immediately after Nixon visit, there was still there was, so people know about Israeli lobby, but they don't know about Taiwan lobby. Taiwan lobby is still very powerful. They bought off a lot of U.S. congressmen. So when Nixon visited China, that started the process of normalization, which happened in 1978 under Jimmy Carter and Deng Xiaoping. But as part of the normalization of ties between China and United States, the U.S. Congress passed the so-called Taiwan Relation Act, which says U.S. needs to come to Taiwan's defense, by which they mean U.S. need to sell weapons to Taiwan. And so this is always a thorn on the side of China-U.S. relationship, continue U.S. weapon sales to Taiwan. But during the Cold War, people don't realize this. U.S. actually stationed nuclear missiles on Taiwan pointing at mainland China. So as part of the Nixon visit, the U.S. military left Taiwan, and U.S. nukes and U.S. missile left Taiwan. But now Trump is trying to put them back in. Well, we're not at the nuclear missile part yet, but now there's 500 Marines on Taiwan right now, and they're sending some U.S. Army Green Berets as observers. So
Just days
the
ago.
Cold
It's
War is
so
back up.
familiar. Like everything's so familiar happening
Yeah,
again.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a they're trying to bring back the Cold War, right? Basically, and so after 1970s, when Deng Xiaoping became the leader of China, this was a honeymoon period between U.S. and China. And China started to open up. One thing China started to like people. I have to remind people, it was not China that closed its door on the United States. The U.S. had an economic sanction on China up till 1970s, up till the Nixon visit and Jimmy Carter's normalization of ties, and then this two sides start trading. But initially, most of the trade was done by intermediaries. Like the first batch of investment that came to China was by overseas Chinese in Hong Kong, in Southeast Asia, uh, from Taiwan as well. But at that time, Taiwan was still under martial law, so they couldn't do direct investment. So a lot of the Taiwan businessmen, they have to shuffle their funds through Hong Kong to China. So there was a lot of so the first initial wave of foreign investment in China was actually by the overseas Chinese, and a lot of these economies already was kind of integrated with American economy to a certain extent because U.S. started to offsource their manufacturing to East Asia in the 1970s. A lot of them landed in places like Taiwan, Hong Kong, the four Asian tigers, right? The Taiwan, Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore. And and then when China opened up, suddenly there's a vast pool of cheap labor that's well educated. And so all the factory bosses in Hong Kong, Taiwan, etc., they all went to China to open shop. So there was a second wave of offsourcing, of manufacturing from places like Hong Kong and Taiwan to China because the labor cost is even cheaper, and then because these factory bosses usually they make goods for exports to United States, so they already have that tie with their customer base in U.S. So now they just turn around and export to U.S. using China, and at that time there were a lot of Taiwan, Hong Kong bosses, in places like in southern China. Many of them have multiple mistresses. It was a good times for those people, and because China was poor at that time, and then when China finally, so at up to that point, China have the so-called most favored nation status in trading with United States, but it's actually really misnomer. For United States, most favored trading nation status actually to any nation that have a normal trading status with United States. If you're not on the most favored trading nation status, that means you are being sanctioned. And so there was an annual debate in U.S. Congress after the Tiananmen Square protest whether to extend to China the most favored trading status. So China decided, you know what, we got to get over this annual congressional circus. So China petitioned to join the WTO in the 2000s, and that is a big game changer after China joined the WTO. This was favored by the big U.S. multinational at this point because they're all
Yeah.
ready to do the labor arbitrage in China. And that was a big moment when so before 2000 it was mostly the overseas Chinese capital that going to China. After China joined the WTO, that's when the big money from those U.S. multinationals, European multinationals, they start to pour in China. Then you have people like Apple, open shops in China. Everybody was making
So
their
China
product
joining
in China.
WTO.
Start
This
from
is
Go
year.
ahead.
This is year 19.
This was early 2000.
Oh, okay.
China joining WTO is in the early 2000. So starting, but Chinese economy already started to take off, um, like I would say even right after end of Cultural Revolution, because I was born in 1976, 1 month after Mao died, and I can tell you, I grew up in China in the 1980s. I could tell you, like I was witnessing life was getting better year by year in China. I have a very happy childhood in China. That's why I always have very fond memories of China, and and things were getting better and better. And but around, because I still remember when I first came to US in 1990, it was still pretty rare to see made in China product. Like my parents, we went Christmas shopping and I saw a teddy bear that was made in China. We're like, oh wow, so surprised. So my parents bought it for me, because it was rare at that time. But like few years later, everything was made in China. It only took about like 5 years
Mm,
for that to happen,
mm,
because China had already built up the production capability in the 80s and 90s when they opened up to the foreign overseas Chinese capital, because it's there's a lot of a lot of wealthy Chinese from Southeast Asia, Hong Kong, Taiwan. They all rush in to build factories in China in the late 80s and early 90s. So by the time when Apple came to China, there's already a very well-established supply chain, right? Apple, they contracted through Foxconn, which is a Taiwanese company, who set up the factory for them and to assemble all the goods. So initially, a lot of the manufacturing was just like making Apple. Like all the components are sourced from elsewhere, from Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, U.S., and you just ship to China for these factory workers to put it together because labor is cheap. But what happened was, that's never what China intended to be doing for the long term. So what China had done was they started to climb the tech tree. They start to, first of all, China investing in education. Before, during the Cultural Revolution, a lot of schools were closed. By the way, a lot of top university were closed. But after that, all the schools were reopened. University were reopened after 1978, and more schools were start to open up. So more Chinese people are getting educated, and a lot of the uh, the overseas Chinese who had operated factories, when they came to set up shop in China, they also brought in like the management techniques, that they brought in their own expertise, the tech expertise with them. And so this happened very organically. And China also sent a lot of students abroad to learn for, in Western universities. My dad was one of them. My dad went to United States in 1985 to study for his PhD. At that time, Deng Xiaoping said, I understand most of them will never come back, but it's okay. Even if only 20% come back to China, that's a net plus for us. So that's what happened. That's, like, I remember at my father's uh, classmates who graduated from U.S. University around early 90s. Many of them stay in U.S., got their green card, got their citizenship, joined the U.S. corporate world. But after they work about 20 years, by 2000s, a lot of them have hit like a glass ceiling, or some people call it bamboo ceiling,
mm.
because whether because of language barrier, or cultural barrier, whatever. A lot of them find they could not rise above to senior management position. And whereas if they go to China, the sky is the limit. They can be founders of companies, they can be CEOs. By the way, that's the story of the founder of TSMC, Morris Chan. So Morris Chan himself was born in China, and then later he immigrated to United States, and he was a top guy at Texas Instrument. But he wanted the top job. He wanted to be the CEO, right? But they never give it to him. They keep on denying him to promote him to the top job. So finally, he said, you know what, forget it. And that's when the Taiwan government came to him and say, hey, we'll give you money, we'll give you all these tax breaks for you to set up this semiconductor manufacturing plant in Taiwan. And he said, okay, let's go. And then he built TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing. Now one of the most valuable piece of tech companies in the world. So, but same thing was happening in China in 2000s. A lot of these Chinese students who went abroad to study, who stayed, work in U.S., gain a lot of experience, and suddenly they find themselves, you know, they're not getting promoted. They're not getting promoted to the top job. They're never going to be CEOs, and so they're like, okay, where I'm going back to China. I can found my own company. I can be CEO. I can be VP. I can be what I want to be. So all the ambitious ones start to go back to China in 2000s, and that kind of kicked off this Chinese miracle. Like this, like Deng Xiaoping already passed away, but I'm sure he had foreseen this. Like this is what he wanted. He sent us Chinese students abroad, so for them to eventually come back to bring back their expertise, their knowledge. But for Americans today, they say, oh, that China are stealing. They're stealing our technology. It's like, look, dude, you did not pay for these Chinese students' education, right? These guys work themselves. They work in those companies. They're the ones. A lot of times, they're the ones who created those technology. Because if you go to American research labs, I did. My dad. I went to visit my dad in University of Illinois at Chicago labs. I look around. It's all Chinese grad students. It's all Chinese grad students working there. So these guys are the backbone of the U.S. science and research, right? And somehow like the Americans think the Chinese, stole their tech, but no, we built your tech. We're the ones who are building your tech. But yeah, so when U.S. companies, especially these Fortune 500 companies, they went to China. They intended for China as they saw as a labor arbitrage opportunity. They intended for China to stay this vast pool of cheap labor for U.S. manufacturing. But China did that, but China did even more when they start to do their own thing, when they start create their own brand, and that's when they became competitor to these Western companies. That's when the Chinese trade started to become unacceptable. It was fine for China just be the cheap labor. Do the sweatshop jobs, making shirts, making Nikes, making Apple phones. Uh, it's not cool when China started making Huawei phones. That's taking market share from Apple, right? That's when United States really went hard against Huawei, because here is a Chinese company, tech company, that has its own develop its own indigenous supply chain, its own indigenous Chinese technology, that's threatening the flagship of American companies like Apple. And that's not acceptable for them. And U.S. putting a lot of political capital to kill Huawei. They arrested the Huawei CFO Meng Wanzhou for supposedly sanction busting on Iran, because Huawei sold telecom equipment to Iran. And yeah, and this is the whole idea is to slow down China's progress, right? This is the whole idea behind the chip sanction against China. They're very explicit. We have to stop China's AI development, because the way to do that is we found the weakest chain, the weakest link in their supply chain, which is semiconductors, because China still had to rely on TSMC, Taiwan Semiconductors, to actually manufacturing the advanced chips. Huawei already started doing their own advanced design for their chips, but once they design it, they send their design to Taiwan to actually make it into a chip. And that and TSMC were able to do that because they source this machine called from ASML, a Dutch company, that basically etch the using laser to etch those chips in like very fine increments, like 5 nanometers, right? This is the most advanced chips in the world. So that's when the US realized, oh, you know what? All these companies, they rely on US one way or other, on like whether a piece of software or US financing. This is our leverage. If we put secondary sanction on companies like Huawei, that means they're not going to, so they can tell the Dutch company, ASML, first they tell the Taiwan Semiconductor, you can no longer make chips for China, for Huawei. And then they tell, then China's like, okay, no problem. We will try to make our own. So they try to import those ASML. They're trying to import those UV machine directly from the Dutch company, and then US went to the Netherlands government and tell you cannot allow ASML to sell their machines to China, and so they wanted to completely choke off the Chinese innovation, and the whole idea is China's AI was developing too fast. And they find that a threat because right now there's a big AI bubble in the United States. Hundreds of billions of dollars are plowed into it, and and the idea is they think they're going to reach the AGI, artificial general intelligence, which means like basically the machine can reasoning like human beings, and they think if they get to that point first, United States will be able to develop Skynet and Terminator, and China will be screwed. So they will have to do whatever to slow down China's progress on AI, so US can get to AGI first. So that's the rationale behind the U.S. semiconductor sanction on China. But that hasn't worked out because China just find ways around. Like they haven't they're now already before China could only make like 24 nanometer chips, and now because of this tech sanction they're forced to come up with a way to make 7 nanometer chips themselves. Still they're still not at 5 nanometer and 3 nanometer level yet because you need UV machine for that, which Dutch are not selling them to them, but they're finding ways around. So instead of use if they don't have 5 nanometer machines, what do? Well, it's fine. We still have 7 nanometer chips. We'll have a whole bunch of machines clustered together, right? I mean, like it's for computing. We okay, sure. Our one chip might not be as powerful as your latest NVIDIA AI chip. We'll just use tons of chips. We'll end up with the same computing power, and at the end of the day, it all comes down to energy consumption because all these AI data centers, they consume a lot of energy. And one thing that NVIDIA still have an edge is because their AI chips. When we're talking about like 3 nanometer, 2 nanometer, that's all marketing term. Doesn't matter. But their AI chip is most efficient, which means it consume less energy, right? But China has a. This is why China has developed a strategy for energy abundance. This is why China is covering desert with solar panels right now and wind power, and they're building nuclear power. They're building everything. So now energy in China is significantly cheaper than energy in the United States. If you look at the energy, the power generation, um, plotted over a period of 20 years. US power generation for the last 20 years flat. Chinese power generation is going up. And that only makes the Chinese energy cheaper and cheaper. And now, because the Chinese production capacity, they made the solar panels cheap. Because solar panels was expensive before because of battery. China has figured out the mass production to mass produce solar panels to make it so cheap. Now the solar power is cheaper than coal-fired power plants because it's easier to maintain. Solar panels, you just need to watch them. You just need to watch them once a while. They'll keep on making electricity. You don't have to keep on burning coal, buy coal to burn, right? I mean, this is free energy from the sun. And so right now China has abundant of energy. So it's okay. Even if their chip is less efficient than NVIDIA chip, they will just use more chips. They have more energy to burn. And that's what DeepSeek did. DeepSeek, they're okay. So the whole U.S. model, starting from times of Windows and Intel duopoly, was Windows keep on producing all these bloated software that require more computing power. So Intel have to come up with more powerful chips, right? So this is how both companies make money. So and Nvidia, so DeepSeek's like, okay, how do we make an AI that have the same performance as American AI, but we don't have to use as much NVIDIA AI chips because that's been blocked by Americans. So like, okay, we'll just improve our algorithm. We make our algorithm more efficient, right? So you optimize the software so you don't have to rely
They
on hardware as much.
wow.
That's how. So Chinese will always find a way around. This is why their sanction, their attempt to slow down Chinese AI progress hasn't really worked. And I think Chinese AI has already caught up with U.S. At this point, but in U.S. it's basically right now we have a giant AI bubble. Meta, the Zuckerberg, he was poaching AI engineers, paying them like minimum $100 million each package, right? And out of the 7 top people they hire for the new Meta AI team, 7 of them are Chinese, and those 7 graduated from Chinese universities. And this is because of the world's top AI researchers, 50% are from China. Are from like those 50%, they usually graduate from Chinese universities and they come to United States for undergrad studies. And many of them stay in US because US obviously those AI company offer insane amount of money, but what happened is that the Trump, Trump right now, he's making really, really difficult for the Chinese students to come to United States. And on top of that, he's cutting fundings to university, to science and research. And they have, Trump, his first term, he started this so-called China initiative, which target the ethnic Chinese science researchers, like they as potential spies. FBI's when open a lot of investigation. I mean, basically, a lot of politically motivated FBI officers who want to make a political career for themselves, they just find that the easiest way for their career advancement is to target ethnic Chinese. Open investigation. It doesn't matter whether they win the case or not. They're showing that they're doing something to stop the so-called Chinese espionage. So this is forcing a lot of Chinese then researchers now are more of them are going back to China. So before I said the most ambitious one already returned to China in the 2000 to open their own companies, but there's still many more who stay in US because they're comfortable, they're complacent. US have higher salary. They're not as motivated to go join, to compete in the very competitive environment in China. But now Trump administration had made it so miserable for those Chinese researchers and scientists. Now they're going back to China in droves. So this is why I say Trump is my president. Is my president for accelerationism. He's the president. He's the greatest American president for China.